Okay, so we're starting chapter 8. This is part A. And so we're talking about is joints. And in fact, we're still in the skeletal system, but what we're looking at now is talking about really how bones are what we call articulated or are interacting with each other, and we form this, what we call. So that's what we call it. We call it articulations, but that's really what a joint is, right? Definition, technically, two or more bones meet together, considered an articulation or a joint, right? So what's the function? Hold the skeleton together, give the skeleton mobility, movement, if you will. And that's really what the function of joints are. Now, when we start taking a look at joints, we'll see that there's many different types of joints, and we have names for each one. And so you'll be responsible for looking at the types of classification as far as the structure and the function, and these names that we use to describe them, right? So talking about that, the first one we'll talk about is the classification based on structure, right? Now, you have to understand the definition because that's important to when we start looking at the name, right? What binds the joint as far as material? And if there's a cavity present. That's really, distinguishes each one from themselves is the material that binds them and then the cavity, right? So we've got three that we talk about as far as structure joints, right? Fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joint, okay? Now we can also classify it by function. And function is just based on the movement. So structure is what it's made up of, basically. And then structure, and then function is how it moves. What kind of movement does the joint allow, right? Synarthrosis is an immovable joint. So we have joints in our body, of course, where two or more bones put together that don't move. Amphiarthrosis, slightly movable, and diarthrosis, freely movable. Okay? So immobile, slightly movable, freely movable, right? And so we'll look at each one here in just a second, right? So going back to the structure joints, right? We'll start taking a look at the fibrous joint first. These bones are joined by dense fibrous connective tissue. And again, we just took a look at the definition of these classifications based on their function. And those are the two ways we classify joints based on structure, right? Material gets used, and if there's a cavity or there's not a cavity, right? Fibrous joints, dense fibrous connective tissue, that's why we call it fibrous joint. And there's no cavity whatsoever, okay? Because we have these two things in this type of joint, most of these joints are immovable, right? So we can classify it based on its function as well. Most of them are immovable, right? Under the fibrous joints, we have three different types, right? Sutures, syndesmosis, and gomphosis, right? So when you hear all of these are all types of fibrous joints, right? And again, a flow chart's really nice to put, right? So if you were to talk about types of joints, right? You were to say these are the structure and these are the function. A little error there, right? And then I say, okay, on the structure, we've got several different types, right? Fibrous, so on and so forth. And by function, we've got this many types. That's good to use to study which ones fall on which, right? That's how I would put it together as far as studying what type falls under what classification, right? Okay, so we'll take a look at the fibrous joints, types of fibrous joints. And the first one we'll look at is a suture. Now, sutures are really easy to memorize, or easy to look at or learn, in fact, because they're joints that lock like sutures or stitches, right? They look like they're stitched together. You can see this on the skull, because if you see the skull, you can see this kind of, we call these sutures, right, where these kind of jagged lines, where you see the skull bones, cranial bones kind of fused together, and that's what they do, right? Very rigid, they interlock. Those are the ones you find in the skull. We'll see this in lab because we'll look at a figure. We'll just kind of, I'll point out the figure that we talk about when we talk about this, right? Where there's growth in youth from the skull, okay? And we call these fontanelles, right? So that's the word we use to describe the skull bones that are not joined together yet, but they will join together later on, right? Later on, those sutures will ossify and they'll fuse together. That's what we see, right? Here's that little jagged line representing a suture. Here's another suture right there. All right, those are your sutures. And again, if we're looking at this, right, and we're looking at the bones that are fused together, this would be an adult brain. Does that make sense? This is past puberty. Okay. We see that these are actually individual bones, pieces that have fused together. And the fusing, and this where two bones or more meet on articulation or joint, is a type of fibrous joint. Okay? And you only find that in the skull, but still a joint nonetheless, right? It's an immovable joint because those actually don't move. They fuse together, and then the remnants of the space in between, what we call a fontanelle, is no longer there. But the line is, right? So again, we're still on fibrous, right? This is still a type of fibrous joint. We call it a syndesmosis. Syndesmosis, right? Now, instead of dense fibrous connective tissue, we're connecting this with ligaments, again, based on material, and if it has a cavity, that's how we classify these. Depending on the length of the ligaments or the fibers, the connective tissue fibers, based on the different lengths, they can give us different movement. Okay? They give you some examples of a short fiber versus a long fiber type of syndesmosis. And the short fibers give you very little, so the shorter the fiber is, the less movement it's going to be. And here's a great example of that, right? The tibiofibular joint. And this is where you have the tibia, right? That would be the tibia bone. And the fibula would be located. And in between, you'd be able to see this tissue here. And I'm going to show this also to you when we look at one of the figures in lab, because we'll see the bone and that connective tissue in between. That is a type of example of a short fiber. So it does give us movement there, but not much. The tibia is actually your shin bone, right? Be below your knee. And that fibula is a little small, real small, thin bone that's kind of attaching itself to your calf muscles, right? The longer fiber, for example, we've got another membrane that looks almost exactly like the membrane that you see in between the tibia and fibula, except they're in between the radius and ulna. So this is in fact your radius and ulna, the forearm bones, and in between of that stuff, there's a connective tissue that's longer, but it allows us to have more movement. And that's in fact how I can twist my wrist like this, because these bones are actually crossing each other. So when I'm doing this, these bones are like that. When I do this, that means this bone right here crosses, in fact, this one. And that fiber inside of it allows us to do. Okay, there's an example here as well. Here's that ligament there as an example, but there's also a ligament all through here as well. It goes all the way up. Syndesmosis, right? Okay, this is called a gomphosis. This is still fibrous. We're still in fibrous. There's 3 subtypes, right? This is easy to remember because it's a peg in a socket. Okay? Where do you find bones where there is a peg in a socket? Teeth are a great example of that. Now, believe it or not, teeth are held in there because there's a fibrous connective tissue called a periodontal ligament or ligaments, right? Obviously, it's not just one, it's many individual, right? This holds the tooth in the socket, and in fact, we can see that there, and if I can change the color here, anything I'm kind of drawing in blue here, there is the periodontal ligament. Okay, all that in blue, and I'll erase it. But you can see that there, right? That's fibrous connective tissue holding the tooth physically to the mandible or maxilla, depending if you're a top jaw or bottom jaw, whatever we're looking at, but it's holding it in place. Okay. Now in tooth decay, what's going to occur is bacteria will eventually begin to erode and degrade this epithelial tissue here. And then once we have an opening, it'll start to invade the ligament and destroy that ligament. And eventually over time, the ligament will be destroyed enough or damaged enough to where this tooth becomes loose and then will fall out. Or the tooth will be invaded through the enamel, right? Okay. So let's move on to cartilaginous joints. Those are a type of joint in our body. So the reason why we call it a cartilaginous joint is because it does have cartilage as far as its material. Okay? We also classified it if it has a cavity or doesn't have a cavity, right? We just talked about that, right? So this one doesn't have a cavity either. Cartilage, no cavity. Fibrous joints, fibrous connective tissue, no cavity, right? So again, that's important to distinguish while you're studying these, right? Slightly movable, not highly movable, so it doesn't move a whole bunch, but it does provide some movement, okay? And there's 2 subtypes, right, that fall under cartilaginous. Synchondrosis and symphysis. Synchondrosis and symphysis. We're going to discuss each one of them, right? So synchondrosis, right? A little bar or plate of hyaline cartilage, right? Hyaline cartilage. And for the most part, all of them are immovable. So when you have your epiphyseal plate, hopefully you remember that, where the diaphysis and the epiphysis meet, right? There's a band of cartilage there that, when dividing, will push up and lengthen the bone, right? This is all the way up into puberty. That's when this happens, right? It's considered a syncarthrosis, right? The cartilage of the first rib to the manubrium of the sternum is considered a syncarthrosis. So you see that there. Here's the epiphyseal plate right here. And again, if there's cartilage there and it's not fused, then you know that this is probably a young individual or somebody still in puberty. But then if you saw this fused, right, where you don't see the blue area, but just kind of a line there, then you know that that would probably be an adult. Here's the first rib here. First rib's there. Here's the sternum, in fact, and the sternum goes all the way down to a point and back up, right? This is your breastplate, commonly known as the breastplate, and this part of the sternum is where that cartilage will join, right? And we're talking about this cartilage being a type of syncarthrosis, right? Will still allow for movement, but slight movement. Very much. And it's the last type of cartilaginous joint we call the symphysis, right? Contains mostly fiber cartilage. So again, the material has changed, right? No cavity, right? So we don't have a cavity there, obviously, or else it would indicate it as a cavity. Very strong by characteristic, can resist a lot of force and tension. They're slightly movable. Two examples, the intervertebral joints. Right, intervertebral joints, vertebral discs, or the cartilage in between your vertebra, right? And the pubic symphysis, and we'll see here, right? Here's the joint in between the bones, right? And in fact, when we look at the spine, each of those bones is individual, right? And it's put together with a series of ligaments, fiber cartilage like this, and muscle holds that spine in place, right? And so you can see half of it cut here. So we've cut half of it. So you can see how the fiber cartilage looks like inside of the disc. And we know for a fact that there is a lot of issues with this, right? Slip disc, where this actually falls out of alignment, right? So it'll go sometimes that direction, or sometimes towards you. I know that's not 3D, but towards you, or away from the lateral medium, right? Or sometimes in, so it can actually go this way too, right? Depending on the force, depending on the conditions, sometimes that can slip out, right? So a lot of issues with that. But normally speaking, you're going to have a lot of force applied up here and a lot of force applied here, depending on what the body's doing at the time, right? So if you're even standing, there's a lot of force applied up, right? And if you're standing and you've got the weight from your body applying this way, you can already tell that that's fiber cartilage has got to be really strong, right? And resist all that force. Okay. This one here is the pubic symphysis. If you notice, this is the coxal bone. These are actually two different bones. They're separate, right? But joined together. Here's a third bone right there in the middle. So those are two hip bones, and in the middle, number 3 is the sacrum, right? Which is another bone, in fact. And then you've got this little tip of that, of another bone, we call it coccyx right there, tailbone. Lying in between number 1 and number 2 is this cartilage right there. We call that the pubic symphysis. That is a symphysis joint, type of cartilaginous joint. During labor, for example, hormones will allow this type of tissue to take in water. And when that tissue takes in water, that fiber cartilage takes in water, it swells up. And when it swells up, it actually causes the pelvic brim, or this circle here, we call this the pelvic brim, to widen, in fact, preparing the mother for birth, right? So that thing will kick up this way, right? It will widen out. And if it widens out, then it will allow the child to pass through the hips. Okay, so let's talk about this one, right? Synovial joints. Now, synovial joints, by definition, the word tells you everything, because that, in fact, every synovial joint will have a synovial joint cavity. So now we're talking about ones that have cavities. Every one that we've talked about so far has not had a cavity except for this one. This one has had a cavity. Now the tissue will vary. It's connective tissue, but you'll see a lot of different representations of that connective tissue. There's ligaments, there is cartilage, different types of cartilage, you have the cavity. I mean, there's a lot going on in synovial joints. It's much more complex put together than the other ones would be. All of them are considered diarthrotic, which means they're freely movable, okay? And they're designed to be freely movable, right? Almost all the limb joints are going to be synovial joints. Almost all of them. There are some that are slightly movable that don't have a synovial cavity, but most of them do. Most of them are, right? So since they're more complex, they're more put together, there's more to talk about in these, right? And so they're, listed below are some characteristics that we're going to discuss, but we'll talk about the features, right? We'll discuss these little bursae or tendon sheets. Bless you. They look like mini synovial joints, cavities, or little pillows of fluid, and they actually help the joint in movement. We'll talk about stability. We'll talk about the types of movement that synovial joints can have. And because of that, we classify them based on those movements. And so we'll see that as well. Okay, so let's talk about the characteristics, the 6 characteristics that every synovial joint will have, okay? Synovial joints will always have articular cartilage. We call this articular cartilage because this is hyaline cartilage, and I told you that there was going to be different types of connective tissue. We're discussing the first type of connective tissue, hyaline cartilage, that covers the ends of the bones that form these joints, synovial joints. It's like an extra covering to prevent friction from rubbing down or damaging the ends of the bones in this movement, because I told you that it was going to be freely movable. There's going to be a lot of movement all the time or consistently. Because of that, the ends of those the bones that form the joint have to have this cartilage, special cartilage covering the edges. We'll see an example of that in the figure. Every synovial joint, by definition, is going to have a synovial joint cavity, right? You can call it synovial cavity, joint cavity, or synovial joint cavity, right? So it's fluid filled. It's a small space, so it looks like a cavity, but it's filled with fluid, and it's got a membrane that actually holds that fluid in there, right? We call that a synovial cavity. Talking about that membrane, if you will, that makes the synovial joint cavity what it is called the articular capsule. And it's got two layers of connective tissue. The external fibrous layer and what we call the synovial membrane. The fibrous layer is dense, irregular connective tissue. So that means the collagen fibers don't run parallel. What I mean by that is this would be dense regular connective tissue. If I was to take a microscope and look at dense regular connective tissue, we'd see these little lines, looks like waves in the water, all in parallel, right? Does that make sense? They're running in one direction. Does that make sense to you? Dense regular. Now, dense irregular run all different ways. Does that make sense to you? That's what we call it, dense irregular. If you looked at the tissues, that's why we call it dense irregular, because the fibers are running in different directions. So which one do you think is stronger, the one on the left or the one on the right? Which one do you look at it and tell me which one, left or right, do you think is stronger? You think right? Lyndon thinks right. Who thinks left? Anybody think left? It's actually left is the correct answer, right? The irregular one is stronger. And why? Why do you think spider webs don't have just lines like this, right? And spider webs actually have them all different directions. Does that make sense? The fibers, if you look at a spider web, they're kind of running in different directions. If you look really close, you'll see it kind of making a web. Does that make sense? That web makes it much, much stronger, right? Because it's holding everything closer together. That's a stronger deal. Back to this is why it's going to be dense, irregular connective tissue, because it's very, very strong. This connective tissue is making the capsule that the synovial fluid is held in. Does that make sense? So when there's pressure, and we'll see it where it's found, but when there's pressure, because it's acting like a cushion, basically. And the fluid is getting pushed consistently. And that fibrous layer holds it together and makes sure that that fluid doesn't come out or doesn't tear. And that's why it's dense irregular. And then inside is synovial membrane lining the fibrous layer. This is made of loose connective tissue, because that's not really the one that's in charge of holding the fluid together, but it is the one that's in charge of making the fluid. That's the tissue, or the row of cells. It's a membrane, so it means a row of living cells that's making the synovial fluid. Okay? Looking at the synovial fluid, in fact, it's a filtrate of plasma. Does anybody know where plasma is found? Where do you find plasma? Blood is made up of cells and plasma. Plasma is the fluid. So what we are discussing, or what we're talking about, is we're taking that fluid and then sending it, because of those cells that line the membrane, from blood vessels through the cells into that cavity that forming the synovial fluid. That's where the synovial fluid's coming from. Does that make sense? Now you can increase and decrease the amount of fluid because of those membranes or the cells gauging that and measuring that and sending more fluid back into the bloodstream or sending more fluid into that cavity. Now what they also are in charge of is making hyaluronic acid. And hyaluronic acid is made by those membranes, synovial membrane cells, and they add it to plasma and then they put it into the cavity and that makes synovial fluid. Hyaluronic acid makes the fluid very viscous, slippery, and it helps to nourish the articular cartilage. Remember, that's the edges of the bone, the ends of the bone. Now notice that that membrane is loose connective tissue and the fluid is fluid, so there's going to be phagocytic cells. Right? And what are those phagocytic cells what are they responsible for? Like Pac-Man, eating away at microbes if they come in there. There's pathogens that come in and try to invade that part of the body. Or if we're breaking down cells or tissue, it'll eat that up as well. So everybody, does that make sense to you? Kind of what we're talking about? Now let's talk about this really quick, because this has kind of helps you to understand what's going on. This is RA, it stands for rheumatoid arthritis, right? It is an autoimmune disorder, or sometimes disease, depending on how long it's and how aggressive it is. Autoimmune basically means the immune system is attacking itself, its own body tissue. And in rheumatoid arthritis, the reason why I'm talking about that is actually it will attack the connective tissue that makes the joint of synovial joints. For some reason, some of these phagocytic cells that we're talking about will recognize those cells, the membrane, the synovial fluid, and the articular cartilage as foreign. Does that make sense? For some reason, it's reading it and saying, okay, you don't belong here, you're a foreigner. And then we'll start attacking it and eating away at the tissue, causing inflammation to occur, and then causing actually destruction of that tissue. What the body will do after a while is then replace that area with scar tissue or build up some of that bone and then cause the bone to fuse or that joint to fuse. And in rheumatoid arthritis, the synovial joints will fuse together. Just to kind of paint a picture why you see the immune system there and how that can go bad sometimes, right? There are different ligaments that hold a synovial joint together. Here are the three ligaments: a capsular ligament, extracapsular ligament, intracapsular ligament. Last one. Synovial joints have a lot of nerves and blood vessels. We just talked about blood and how we get synovial fluid from blood in the form of the plasma, the liquid portion of blood. But we also know that blood feeds us, right? So nutrients will be sent to that area so that connective tissue can continue to grow and to regulate, to adjust. We know that to be true. And we know that this happens in the nervous system. We know that there is nerves that feed into the joints, and there is a lot of them, and it's complex. And the reason why is because we want to gauge what's going on there. First of all, pain, right? So the nerves can recognize an injury in the synovial joint. Joint position, where the joint is in space, right? There's that. And any stretching. So if the joint is stretched, or if the ligaments are stretched, or if the muscles stretched around that area, the nervous system's reading that information. Here's your typical synovial joint, right? So we see bone on the top here, bone at the bottom. The definition of a joint is where two or more bones meet together. We call this an articulation. This is our joint. So you could even say that this would be the finger. Pick one of these little bends of your finger, and this is kind of what we'd be looking at. That would be representative of what we have inside of our joint in one of the bones of our fingers, right? And what we're seeing here, first of all, is this blue area, and I'll just kind of shade the blue area in red just to kind of, or surround it there, right? That would be considered articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is covering one end. You'll see articular cartilage covering another end on that side. This is where those bones will sometimes interact with each other. That prevents then bone from rubbing against each other or getting damaged or crushed. Surrounding the cavity, because this is the cavity, in fact, anything in green here is the cavity. So anything down over here in this area is cavity, right? That's what's going to have the fluid inside of it. And then lining the cavity is the synovial membrane, which is the green line, and that fibrous layer, which is that purple area there. That makes the articular capsule. And finally, you see one ligament way out here holding that joint together. But obviously you would see other ligaments kind of holding the joint together, reinforcing the joint itself. Okay? Some synovial joints have a fat pad, which means there's this really thick fatty layer between the synovial membrane and the fibrous layer of the capsule. There's some fat in between, extra cushioning, depending on when this bone, what's getting used there. And some of the joints have what we call an articular disc or a menisci. It's an extra fibrocartilage that will be reinforced between the articular surfaces, between where two bones meet. There will be an extra piece of cartilage. We talk about the articular disc or the menisci, right? And in the knee, for example, you have two different menisci, lateral medial menisci, and that can be torn, but that's right in between the knee. We'll see. Okay. Now, when we discuss bursae and tendon sheets, they're actually little bags of synovial fluid. They're not the synovial cavity, nor are they found in the synovial cavity, but they're extra kind of bags of synovial fluid that are found around certain types of joints. And they act as a ball bearing. So if you know what a ball bearing is, right? Kind of the ball kind of helps movement, right? Acts as a go-between. And they are helpful to reduce, for example, friction of tissue against tissue, right? So what is a bursae, right? Or bursa, right? This is anywhere where you see ligaments, muscle, skin, tendons, or bone. Mix and match of those, doesn't matter. Rub together or kind of articulate together, right? You'll see a bursae. And the tendon sheaths are types of bursae that kind of wrap around a tendon. That's why we call them tendon sheaths. They should have been called tendon bursae because that's kind of what they are. Little bursae that surround a tendon. I showed you here, this tendon right here goes all the way up to inside of here. Does that make sense? Like way up here. See, if you track that tendon all the way up, it goes all the way and kind of joins your scapula way up here. Does that make sense to you? It goes all the way down, becomes the belly of the muscle, which is that's the muscle that you can feel, hold, you know, push, whatever. Okay? And notice my position of my hand, right? The insertion point is kind of right here where your radius is. Does that make sense? Your bone, it goes over your kind of where your elbow is, and it kind of inserts kind of right there. Does that make sense to you? Origin insertion. Now, if I isolate my hand, right, which means I'm not doing this and then doing this or this and that or whatever, I'm just kind of doing this. And I do this, okay, just that movement right there. Okay, back and forth, that movement right there. I've used my bicep muscle to contract, and when it contracts, it's going to pull basically the bone and everything that comes with it up. Does that make sense? If my fingers were the tendon, it would go this way. Does that make sense to you? When it stops contracting, when I relax it, this is what happens. When I contract it, this is what happens. In fact, that's what we're looking at here, right? Origin insertion. Contraction causes insertion to move towards what? The origin, yeah? You see how this is moving towards the origin this way? I mean, I can go all the way to here, and I'm really close. Never touching really, but I can do that. Does that make sense? Wide, right? Big angle here, and then short, 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 short. Does that make sense to you? I'm moving, in fact, in a certain plane, right? This would be the sagittal plane, right? Does that make sense to you? Or transverse, I mean, you can look at it that way, depending on how you move it. Okay? That can't work unless there's going to be synovial joints that help move that, because what is the synovial joint that's moving? Where do you find that? Which joint is moving? The elbow, right? You don't need to know the technical name, just the elbow is moving. So this is moving right here. So this joint is actually 3 bones, not 2, right? It's the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. These 2 forearm bones. They all kind of meet right here at this area, and this would be considered a synovial joint. Does that make sense to you? That is the movement creating this. Now, when I use this movement, and I use this movement, and I use, I don't know, this movement, I can do this kind of movement. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? I've used many joints, not just if I want to do this, or that, or this, right? I've used this joint, all of these joints, in fact, that joint and that joint to create the movement I'm creating. That's how we can move different things. Okay, so let's talk about this range of motion, right? So this range of motion, in fact, we talk about the different planes we're moving in, okay? Talks about what planes we're moving our joints or the movement is going to be in, right? So we use non-axial to describe that we're just slipping or gliding over bone. We're not rotating or doing any other the other movements or moving in a plane per se. Uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial. Uni means one, so that means in one plane. Biaxial means in 2 planes, and multiaxial means in all 3 planes. What we're discussing, the way you classify them, is based on what kind of movement that joint is going to do. Okay? Does that make sense to you? What joint is going to do? What movement? Now, when you're gliding or slipping over another surface, this is what we're talking about in a gliding joint, right? Some examples there for you. Like your intercarpal joints and intertarsal joints. That means your wrist bones and your ankle bones, right? Where all those bones are interacting. Those are the joints. And they glide or slip over each other. And in the vertebrae, in fact, the vertebrae are also a gliding joint. Here's an example of a gliding joint, right? By doing this, right, so this is what they're actually was happening, right? We're not moving any of this, we're just moving the wrist like this. So if I isolate, if I even grab this and just did this is kind of what we're seeing. And in fact, none of these other bones up here are moving whatsoever. None of these bones down here are moving. We're just moving those bones right there in the middle. Really important to understand because we're talking about just this. Well, those bones, when they're kind of close together like this, will just kind of glide over each other, slip over each other, or kind of rock. And when they all do that, I can, wave basically with my hand. Angular movement talks about angles, okay? Increasing or decreasing an angle between two bones. The bicep flex that I just did, muscle, is the increase and decrease of an angle, right? Moving towards the sagittal plane. This is how we use these words, right? Flexion, extension, hyperextension. So we'll get to then start. This one uses uses a joint right here, kind of right by the ear, to make that movement. Does that make sense? In this particular example. That joint movement between the vertebrae and the skull is what's causing this kind of head going back and, up and down. Now, other joints can do this too, just that one. This joint right here, or joints, in fact, between the vertebrae and the hip and the femur, in fact, cause this rotation or this movement. And in fact, it's the femur attached to the hip that's moving and doing this, right? This bowing, if you will. Notice that nothing else is moving, not even the neck or the head. It's that joint that's making that whole half of the body, basically, on the hips move, flex, extend, and hyperextend. So you can apply it anywhere, right? Here's that joint there. Here's that joint there in the knee. And you can see that there, right? Depends on what joint it's going to be, right? But just to tell you, it's not just one joint that does the one thing. It can do many different places. Here's another angular movement, right? Abduction, adduction, and what we call circumduction. Abduction and adduction move along the frontal plane. And yes, you can read words and memorize the word or the sentence, but it's better if you practice it because that makes a lot of sense. And if you know your planes, you might have to go and review like for 2 minutes. Oh, okay, I remember this is sagittal, this is frontal, this is transverse, right? Divides up and down, left and right, front and back. Okay, got it. Abduction moves it on the frontal plane. So this will be the frontal or coronal plane, right? So when my hand was the plane. And abduction and adduction move it towards and away from the midline. So this is the midline. We're moving stuff this way and that way. And abduction and adduction do this, right? Okay? We'll see this in a second. Circumduction does not only abduction and adduction, it does all of them. Okay? And actually can help us make a cone in space, which means if your joint can make a circle in space, then that means it's a circumduction, can undergo circumduction, which means this, right? If I can draw a circle in the air like this, that means that's circumduction. Does that make sense? You can do that with your leg if you want to. You can draw a leg. That is. So here's the circle I was talking about. There's the cone, right? You make a circle, then that means that joint is circumduction, right? Can undergo circumduction. Here's abduction and adduction. Take your hand and kind of go this way and that way. Or you can take your leg and do this, right? There's exercises, for example, if you go work out, that you can work your adductor and abductor muscles. Those are the muscles lining your inner and outer thigh. Move your thigh back and forth, right? Rotation, just turning the bone on its own axis. We see that in the vertebrae and in the humerus and femur. Here's rotation, right? Rotating, right? Here's rotating your head. This is the classic movement, right? And it's actually rotating. So what we're talking about is C1 and C2. Those vertebrae, the spine bones, can rotate this way. This is what's causing that no movement. Does that make sense, right? Those bones are doing this. There's muscle that allows the bones to turn like this, and muscle that allows it to turn back. That's what we're seeing there. We can do that in the rest of the spine, just not as aggressively, right? Does that make sense? That means I can do this and I can go back this way, which means I'm not just rotating the C1, C2, I'm rotating the back lower vertebrae. And they're showing you that you can do that in the femur there. You can rotate your femur, go out and in. So you see how the foot goes this way and then back this way. So if you can rotate your foot like that you're doing rotation. Okay. Supination and pronation. When we talk about movement, we can do that in the radius and ulna. That means we can rotate them over each other and back down. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion is always the foot. This is rotating the ankle or the foot up and down, pointing your toes down, pointing your toes up. Here's supination and pronation. Again, these are all about practice, right? So you got to practice them. If you practice them, they're going to make a lot more sense than just studying words. Memorizing words is probably not going to be helpful because there's a lot of words to memorize. Working these out and say, what am I doing? Pronating. What am I doing? Supinating. Pronating, supinating. Pronating, supinating. Okay, I got that one. That's how you learn that stuff. Okay. Notice the angle or the direction of the radius and ulna. And when I cross them over, it's palm up, palm down. That means I've crossed them or made an X, basically. Just like that. Supination, pronation, right? Crossing over. There's dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, always the feet, right? Point your toes up, point your toes down. There's inversion and eversion, protraction. That's how we actually rotate that. Not pointing back and forth, we're in and out, right? Forward and backwards. Elevation, depression, etc., etc. All right. So finally, before we go on to the next part, 6 different types of synovial joints based on the shape of the articular cartilage, but also the movement. And we really concentrate on the joint movement. Okay? So the ones that we described are the ones that we're talking about are moving the body in certain ways. These are talking about movement of the joint in certain ways. Okay? So here are all the joint movements here, synovial joint movements, right? Plane, hinge, pivot, condyle, saddle, and ball and socket. And I decided to put these in the book, from the book, because they're helpful to look at, because the figures really help with this, right? So, planar joint, non-axial movement, they usually glide. So if these cubes represented the wrist bones, and I move those wrist bones, we would glide one way and the other. Like if you're doing this, that means those bones are gliding over each other like this, or they're going forward and backwards, gliding over each other like that. And if I can, make a fist, that's kind of what those bones are kind of gliding over each other. The hinge joints, those are really interesting, right? Always uniaxial. They're always going to do that flexion extension kind of thing. Hinge on a door, this is what we see there. The elbow joint is a great example of that. So is the knee. The knee is a hinge joint, right? Here's the rotation one. This is what we call a pivot, right? That's the rotation joint. This does that rotation, pronation, supination, right? Making the X on the radius ulna and then opening it, supinate, protonate. What's happening is right at the elbow, we've got this ligament that holds the head of the radius there and helps it rotate like this. Condylar joint is kind of like a ball and socket, but except it's a really small one. You usually find these in the example that you usually find is in the bones of the fingers, right? And that can be biaxial. It can move in two planes, right? Saddle joint, kind of what you find, for example, in the thumb and the big toe, where it saddles itself over. All right, biaxial as well. Finally, the ball and socket, that's the multi-axial. That's your shoulder, that's your femur, your hip bone, and your femur. 3 different planes, right? In fact, and more. Just showing you 3, but there's many in between all of that.